We're learning Sicha Beis of Parshas Shoftim in Chelek Yutes, which is on page 171. This Sicha here, the Rabbi said, the Shabbos after the 6-day war, and as you can see from the conclusion of the Sicha, the main reason the Rabbi said it was in connection to the tremendous miracles that happened then, specifically in Mitzrayim. And the Rebbe takes a message from the Psukim that it says regarding miracles that the Eibishter performs in Mitzrayim, and that's relevant even regarding the Mitzrayim Bizman Hazeh. But most of the Sicha is a discussion al Pinigla, benegea to the status of the Goyim living in Mitzrayim Bizman Hazeh, whether we could consider them to be the same Mitzrayim that were there thousands of years ago, or it's different people. It's a new nation, and therefore the halachas that apply to the Mitzrayim then maybe do not apply today. So there are two things that the Rebbe will discuss in connection to the halacha of the Mitzrayim Bizman Hazeh, as we'll see here in the Sicha. From Pasik beParshaseinu, v'liyashav v'sa'am Mitzrayim goymer, v'Hashem amalachem, lo'sisifun loshav b'derech hazeh oid. So it says in this week's Parsha, do not return the nation to Mitzrayim, do not go again on this way to Mitzrayim. Lernt min arois the halacha is learned out, as ayid tar sich nit umkehren, besetzen sich l'shtakeya in Mitzrayim. That you may not return with the intention to settle. L'shtakeya means not just as a visit, but to go there to settle in Mitzrayim. Unochmer, b'lashon Chazal, even more, it says in the Yerushalmi, and the Rambam quotes it, as the Rebbe brings here, Begimel mekaymis huzuri Yisrael shlei lashav eretz Mitzrayim v'chulu. This is something so important that the Torah warns about this 3 times, not to return to Mitzrayim. The Rambam in sein Sefer Yad HaChazaka bringt up dem din as metarnet weinen in Mitzrayim. The Rambam quotes this halacha that you're not allowed to live in Mitzrayim. Bringt up the Maimah Chazal begimel mekaymis esira Torah v'chulu. Also quotes this Maimah Chazal that the Torah warns about this 3 times. Und von stimas l'shoina is mashma. From the fact that the Rambam does not specify otherwise, it seems as the Isser is Eich da Bizman Hazeh, that this is an Isser that applies even today. Und the Rebbe gefindt man im Mefarshim a greise shakel v'tarya, and because of this, there's a big discussion in Mefarshim, wie zayat der Rambam ba'atzmai gemerkt weinen in Mitzrayim, und bechlal doch dort gewähn asach jüdische Kehilles chulu. How was the Rambam himself allowed to live in Mitzrayim? He lived there for many years, and there were many Kehilles, Yiddish communities that were in Mitzrayim for many years. How is that allowed? If there's these Yisurim. Some of the Asbeidim are brought here in the Ha'aris, in the Shuli Agilion, and the Rebbe refutes some of them. You can take a look. Very interesting discussion about this. Darf man verstehen. So that this is the halacha regarding living in Mitzrayim, that it's relevant even today. But now the question is, beim Isser chitun mit Mitzri. There's another halacha that relates specifically to Mitzrayim, which is the Isser of not getting married to a Mitzri, even a Mitzri that converts and is a ger, bis dar shlishi, until the 3rd generation. Paskin the Rambam, so the Rambam there says that it's not relevant today anymore. Kesha'Allah Sancherev Melech Ashur, Bilbul Kolo Umais V'irvim Zebezeh, the king of Sancherev, the king of Ashur. He came into the world and he mixed everything. He displaced people from one place to another. V'higla Yisamim Mekaimam. Ve'elu ha-Mitzrayim shebe'eretz Mitzrayim ata anosham acherimim. The Mitzrayim today in Mitzrayim are not the original Mitzrayim that lived there. It's different people. Hayel v'nesarvus, since everybody was displaced. So therefore, huter, hakel. So now you're allowed, any person, any guy that's Megayer, and even if he's a ger that comes from Mitzrayim, you're allowed to marry him immediately. Shekol ha-pirish mehen les gayer, cheskasa yishapirish min ha-rayv. Any Mitzri that comes to be Megayer, the assumption is, the chazak is that he's coming from the Rayv, and therefore Rayv are not Mitzrayim. Rayv Gaim in the world are not Mitzrayim. So therefore, since he was Mavalvel Kol Olam Kuloi, so the person that was Megayer is assumed to be not a Mitzri, so you could go and marry him immediately. So here the Rambam is saying that this halacha is not relevant Bizman Hazeh. So now the question is, and we bald as Bizman Hazeh is Eretz Mitzrayim a land von Anoshim Acherim. Eretz Mitzrayim today is not anymore a land of the original Mitzrayim. It's a land of other Goyim that live there. Was stammen nicht von the Amalek Mitzrayim. They're not even descendants from the original Mitzrayim. Hein verwas is euch jetzt tchal the Issa loshav Mitzrayim. So why is this Issa, to return to the land Mitzrayim, still applied even today, as it seems from the Rambam? That doesn't make any distinction about that. So that's the question that the Rebbe will be discussing in this entire Sikha, these two halachas. The halacha of not living in Mitzrayim, and the halacha of not marrying a Mitzri that's Megayir until the third generation. When it comes to living in Mitzrayim, it applies even today. When it comes to not marrying a Mitzri, it does not apply today. What's the difference? L'chayre wollten gekent empferen. So seemingly we can answer, wie kann man Mefarshim sagen, as other Mefarshim already say, as der isse Yeshiva Mitzrayim is nit zu lieb die dortige Menschen Mitzrayim. The Isra of not living in Mitzrayim is actually not related to the Mitzrayim that live there. Nor mitzad dem land allein. It's related to the very land itself, the place itself. Eretz Mitzrayim, the land of Mitzrayim, afilu ven Mitzrayim, afilu ven Mitzrayim, that is, afilu ven Mitzrayim is nor der Eretz. Even if it's just the land, the physical place, which is the location called Mitzrayim, that's the place that the Torah does not want you to return. Even if there are no Mitzrayim left there anymore, nevertheless, the Isser still applies. And the Rebbe first brings a proof for this. From Lashon Rambam, we can see this from what the Rambam paskins, and also the exact words that the Rambam says in the Vaita de Halacha, in the next halacha of what we just quoted. So the Rambam says as follows: V'yiroeli, it seems to me, She'im Kovash Eretz Mitzrayim Melech Yisrael al pi Bezdin. If Eretz Mitzrayim was conquered through a king, a Melech Yisrael, and according to a Bezdin, Shehi Muteres, then it will be allowed to live in this place in Mitzrayim. V'lo Yisira, the Torah does not warn, Elo Loshav lo Yechidim, only individuals that return there. Oy Lishkeim ba, to live there, V'hi biyad akum, and it's still in the hands of Goyim, because the actions of the place Mitzrayim is much worse than in all other lands. That's the translation of the words that the Rambam says here. So as you can see the words being highlighted here, the Rebbe is highlighting three diyukim here. Akum, the Rambam says that it's in the hands of Akum, of Goyim, does not say Mitzrayim. He says Maseha. Maseha refers to the place, to the land. Maseha mikol kolin. And he says mikol ha'arotzos. In other words, we're contrasting this land to other lands. We're not talking about the people, the Mitzrayim, original Mitzrayim there, but this land in contrast to other lands, as the Rebbe spells out now. But from them is mashma. So from this language and this psak of the Rambam, it seems, as der Isser is mipnei shemaseha von Eretz Mitzrayim. It's because of the behavior of the people in this land Mitzrayim, und nit shemasehem von the Akum mikol kolin. Not, the Rambam does not say that it's the maisim of the Goyim. It's the maisim of the people that's the issue, but it's the issue of the land. This is a land that causes certain behavior that's not good. Maseha of the land is a place that you shouldn't be. Al derech ma'im chazal. What's this concept? What does this mean that the place brings about a certain behavior? So this is something that it says in the Medrash. Yesh mayonis shemegadlin chulu v'yesh tufim bezimo. You have a place that has well springs that raises people that are well behaved, and then you have a place that the very place, the location, the springs and the land itself raises people that are shtufim bezima, that are very bad behaved, that are immoral. And that's what Mitzrayim is. The issue is with the very land itself. Under Iber, oibzi is biyad akum, and here comes the other diuk. The Rambam is saying that as long as it's still under the possession, under the control of Goyim, so he doesn't say specifically Mitzrayim, but he says akum, afilanit biyad Mitzrayim, even if it's not in the hands of the original Mitzrayim, is maseh mekul kolin. So because they're in such a kind of land that raises immoral people, so their actions are not proper. And therefore, you may not live there. So this explains also the halacha itself, the chiddush that the Rambam here is saying, v'yirali, was dafke when a melech Yisrael is kovish eretz Mitzrayim, al pi bezdin, megmen dan sich basetzen dorten. It's not enough that you have one individual or a few Yidden or a group of Yidden that come to Mitzrayim, or even maybe a king that conquers the place, but it has to be specifically a king that's conquering al pi bezdin, that he's really changing the whole essence of this place, of the very land itself. Which means as follows. Durch Chazak, Kibush, it's only when it's conquered in this kind of a way. When it's not just a melech, but it's not just, and then it's not, for sure, not even just individuals, but it's a melech, al pi bezdin, that changes the very land itself, that it becomes ke'eretz Yisrael l'chol davar. That now it becomes like, just like Eretz Yisrael, for everything. It changes the very place itself. That's the halacha. It gets the status of Eretz Yisrael. When it's conquered al pi melech, al pi bezdin, it gets the halachas and the status of Eretz Yisrael. Only then does the very land itself change. The says that kibush is poel hashini muhusful land. It causes a change in the very identity of the land itself. Und the ribbe wird bottled der issel dort. And only then does it take away the prohibition to settle there and to live there. So this explains why the Isser of living in Mitzrayim is not connected to which are the people that are living there. Are the original Mitzrayim still there? Are they not still there? Even if they're not, even if it's just Akum. But the land itself is Mekulkul. It brings about bad behavior, immoral behavior, and therefore the Torah does not want you to return there. On the other hand, though, the Isser of not marrying a Mitzri until the third generation that's Megayeth, so that of course is only a descendant of the original Mitzrayim. And therefore in Mitzrayim today, where Raiv of them are not the original Mitzrayim, so as the Rambam says, it's Peirish min Raiv, we go according to the majority, and therefore it's not Mitzrayim. Says aber doch nit glatt. However, this answer is not fully smooth, because this is, Rabbi here is explaining according to the Lashon of the Rambam in Sefer Hayad. But if you look in the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs, there he seems to be saying it differently. In Sefer HaMitzvahs schreibt the Rambam, as the Tame Isser is, Shaloi Nilmad Mimaseihem B'chulu. Here the Rambam says that the reason why one should not return to settle in Eretz Mitzrayim is not to learn from their behaviors, in other words, the Mitzrayim's behaviors. Das heißt, ist es zu lieb nicht ableinen sich von den Mitzrayim, Menschen von Eretz Mitzrayim. It's not, the issue is not the very land itself, but the issue is the people, the Mitzrayim. It's their behavior that the Eibusher does not want us to learn from. Und like dem Tam, darf man doch mevai sein, so according to this reason in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, we still need to explain, for was is da der Isser euch bis man hazeh? Why does this Isser apply even today? Nachdem was Elu HaMitzrim sheberet Mitzrayim ata anoshem acherim. If today the people living in Mitzrayim are not the original Mitzrayim, it's different people living there. So according to the Hezbollah of the Rambam in Sefer Hayad, we have an answer. But according to what the Rambam says in Sefer HaMitzvahs, so the question still remains. V'oid, another point, oib mitzad eretz megadeles. Going back to what we said before, that from the Rambam in Sefer Hayad, it's mashma, that the issue is just the very land itself, that it raises people that are immoral. Is a filav and sekenet zayin, the mitzias von nilmud mimasayim. So then, even if it's a situation where there's nobody to learn from, al derech hazman ven v'hoyse eretz Mitzrayim l'shma magoyme l'save b'regel adam, a time period when there'll be nobody there, it'll be totally desolate, nobody's living there. This is given bizman of Nebuchadnezzar, as it was in the time period of Nebuchadnezzar. Darf sein der Isse betokfei. The Isse should remain in that time as well. It doesn't matter if there's no one to learn from, it's just the very land itself. So maybe according to the Rambam in Sefer Hayad this is true, but not according to the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs, where he says, Shalei nilmad mimaseihem. So just like in that time period when no one's there, the Isser does not apply. So today, when there's no original Mitzrayim there to learn from, so the Isser shouldn't apply either. So what's the difference between this Isser, that still applies today, and the Isser of not marrying a Mitzri till the third generation, which does not apply today? So here the Rabbi brings a levush. The levush adds one detail that gives us an opening to understand the difference. Wegen dem Isser lovei bekol von a Mitzri schreibt the levush. So regarding this Isser of not allowing a Mitzri to marry into Klal Yisrael until the third generation, so the levush says, when did this Isser apply in earlier generations? Today. After Sancherev came, Sancherev removed the original Mitzrayim and brought other Goyim to live there. Although definitely a minority of the Mitzrayim, some of them did remain there in their original place in Mitzrayim. And he adds more, Vahavale kavua. And here there's a concept called kavua. The concept of kavua is, as the Rabbi is going to quote soon, the source in the Gemara and Ksubis Daf Tezvav and in other places, usually the halacha always is, when you have a doubt about something, how to identify something, so you always follow the Rav, you follow the majority. With the exception of kavua. If the minority is something which is established in a permanent place of its residence or of its permanent location, so then that minority will not be ignored. You cannot ignore a minority that's permanent in its place. And then I cannot follow the majority. That's the concept of kavua, which is learned from a pasuk. And the idea of the concept is, every time you're following the majority, you're ignoring the minority. So the pasuk is telling us, if the minority has a certain significance because it's kavua, it's established in a permanent place, that can't be ignored. And therefore, in such a case, you don't follow the majority. So over here, these original Mitzrim, some of them did stay there, and it's not only that they're a minority, but they have a certain significance, because this is their permanent residence. So therefore, they're kavua. And the rule is, v'chol kavua kemechza al mechza dami. Whenever we have a minority, but it's kavua, it's permanent, we treat the minority and the majority to be like half and half. In other words, we can't follow the majority in this case. So therefore the question is, why are we saying that Bizman Hazeh, that Sancherev removed most of the Mitzrayim, there's a heter to marry a Mitzri that's a ger right away. You don't have to wait. Why don't you have to wait? It's a situation of kavua. So there's a suffix here. The person you're marrying may actually be a descendant from the original Mitzrayim. Makol Mokayim, however, this concept of kavua is only when that minority is actually there in his permanent residence. That's what gives him the chshivas. But oisleishim is gayer hareo pirish mehem. The Mitzri that comes and converts, he's separating, he's going away from his permanent residence. V'chol de parish miruba kaparish. And the rule is that if you're not in your permanent residence, so then you do follow Rav. Then you're contrasting the majority and the minority, and you follow the majority. And therefore, a Mitzri that's megayed and is pirish from his permanent residence, you're allowed to marry him immediately. That's the hesber of the levush. So as we could see here in the language of the levush, that he's bavarening, he's discussing this concept of the miyut that still exists, and therefore the concept of kavua. So this is a little bit more complicated than we thought. It's not just as simple as that today Sancherev was muvalvel kol ha'olam, there's no Mitzrayim left there at all, so no problem, you could marry a Mitzri. No, there is a miyut, and that miyut may be kavua. So therefore his hesbid is, but that miyut is pirish. It's leaving its permanent residence, and when you're pirish, the rule remains that you follow the Rav, and therefore you can marry a Mitzri today immediately. So now, olafizeh, as miyutam nisheru b'mekaymaisam, that some of the Mitzrayim did remain in their place, even after all the nations were displaced by Sancherev. Is move on. So we can understand why the Isser of not settling in Mitzrayim applies even today. It's because of those few Mitzrayim that are still there. And as long as they stay there in their permanent location in Mitzrayim, we can't say, oh, they're only a minority, let's just ignore them. No, they are kavua, they are significant, and you can't ignore them. As long as they don't separate and they don't leave their permanent location when they become a ger, they still have the halacha of being kavua, they're there in their permanent residence, and therefore we can't annul their existence, so you can't go and settle in Mitzrayim, because of the fact that the Mitzrayim is still there and you could learn from their deeds, from their behavior. This is the hesber according to what the levush says. So l'chayr is very clear. But the Rebbe questions the entire hesber, the whole premise of what the levush says here. The question over here, though, is Favos pasken the Rambam bestome an azayich the Shulchan Aruch as a ger Mitzri is itzt mutter miyad bebas Yisrael tzalibim tam shepirish min arayv. According to the hesber of the levush, how could the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch just simply say, without any distinctions, without any reservations about this, that today a Mitzri that's megayer, you could marry him immediately because you follow the Rav, he's pirish. He left his permanent residence, so therefore you can marry him immediately. Which means that there's in every case there's no distinctions about this. You could always marry a Mitzri immediately. Wie bald, as Amiyat Mitzrayim, Zenem Gimblibim b'Mekaymaisam. But the question is, there is a minority of the Mitzrayim that did remain there in their place. Hat doch gedacht, austeitschen, mechalik sein. So if so, the Rambam and so on, they should make the following distinction. Zi der Chiton is beäufen as the Ger Mitzri is bepoil peirish akar ozel von sein Bayis. Is it a situation where the marriage is taking place when the person is leaving his location, he's leaving his permanent residence and coming to marry a Yid? So then, because he's leaving his place, which is kavua, he's living in his house, and he's leaving his house, and he's coming to marry a Yid out of his house, so he left his permanent location. So then I could say that the concept of roiv applies, because when you're peirish, then you go according to Rev. As Dambult is the klal, called a parish v'chulu. Or that is nit also from sein bias. Or if it's a situation where the Mitzri is marrying a Yid, and the Mitzri remains in his house, in his permanent location, from sein bias. Was Dambult hatte dem din von kavua. So then, if he remains in his permanent place, so then he's kavua kemechza mechza dami. So the doubt still remains, maybe the person you're marrying is a Mitzri, even though the Mitzrim are the minority, but we treat it kemechza mechza if the person you're marrying is in his permanent place. So this is a distinction that the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch should make. How can you just say that today you're allowed to marry any Mitzri, including if you're in Mitzrayim? It matters if it's parish or kavua. Al derech vi be'inyan dugmasai. We find similar to this that it's brought in the Gemara. Wie the Gemara sagt in Ksubis, wie Rashi and Tosfos and dort Masber, as the din from kol de parish, this halacha of kol de parish, that only if the one that goes away from his permanent place, then I follow roiv, is dafke, when the boil is parish from sein bias. So over there in that Gemara, it's talking about a situation where a woman had a relationship with someone, and we're trying to figure out who this man is. So we're looking at the city. Who are most of the people in the city? If most of the people are Yidden, if most of the people are Kshedim, so we can assume that the Baal was a kosher person. If not, then it's the opposite. But then the Gemara there says, though, that it will make a difference where this incident took place. If it could be that it took place in the house of the Baal, in the place of that man where he lives, his permanent residence, so then you can't follow the Reiv. So you see there in the Gemara very clearly this concept, that Kovua follows the status of the person as far as where his permanent location is. And what is his permanent location? His house. If so, over here as well, how could the Shulchan Aruch just simply say, according to this Hasbro of the Levush, that you can marry a Mitzri today immediately when he converts? You don't have to wait 3 generations. It should make a difference if it's in his house or he left his house. But Pashtus came in Zogen, so simply the answer would be as follows. When a Mitzri comes to be Megayer, so he had to leave his house in order to be Megayer. When he comes to be Megayer, that's the moment that we look at to say, oh, he left his permanent location. He has to be Megayer, so it entails different things. There's a Mila, Tvila, whatever else he's doing. So that we assume that he left his house for Mila and a Tvila. And therefore, the situation of marrying a Mitzri is Pairish. He was Pairish from his place, and therefore we can say that that is the reason why we assume that you can marry a Mitzri Bizman Hazeh following the Reiv. Aber, however, das is nit maspik. This is not, in this case, this is not enough of an answer. Weil benidden die dan is nit genug das was is Pairish mi Beisai. Here, it's actually not even going to be enough for the Mitzri to leave his house in order for it to be considered pirish, that he left his kavua residence in order to be able to follow Reiv. Nor a dav zayin a pirish from Gan Eretz Mitzrayim. The only way you can follow Reiv for this Mitzri is if he leaves the entire land Mitzrayim. Only then is he considered to be a pirish from his permanent place. Why is that? Where do we find such a concept that parish refers to a person leaving his entire country, his entire place? The Rebbe quoted before the Gemara in Ksubis, where we were having a suffix about a boil. There it clearly says in Rashi and Tosfos that it refers to the house, if he was parish from that house that he lives in or not. So the Rebbe brings there another Gemara that discusses a similar situation, and there it clearly says that parish refers to being parish from that entire country or that entire area. The Gemara sagt in Yevamis, Ovid kechavim shekiddush bizman hazeh, a guy that was mekadesh a yid today, chayshishin lekedushin. We're concerned about this kedushin; it may have taken effect. Even though it's a guy, there's no Kedushin by a guy, because Shema Maseres HaShvatim Hu. Maybe this guy comes from the 10 Shvatim that were exiled from Eretz Yisrael during the time of the first base of Mikdash, and they were assimilated amongst Goyim, and therefore perhaps this guy comes from the Aseres HaShvatim. Fragt the Gemara, but the Gemara asks on this, V'akol de Parish Meruba Parish. Anybody that's coming from Goyim that you marry today is coming from the Raiv. So how could you say that there's a concern that maybe this guy or this person might be the minority of those Aseres HaShvatim that were assimilated amongst Goyim? And for the Gemara, beduchte de kvi. This concern of the Gemara was only in that place where there's a kvius, where the Aseres HaShvatim settled and it's their permanent location. That when they were exiled from Eretz Yisrael, so they were placed in these cities of Chalach and Chabur and so on. So in those specific locations where they were placed, over there, if you marry a guy, then you have to be concerned because the Aseres HaShvatim are kavua there, so even if they're the miyot, they're not going to be batal. That's what we're talking about. Taich Rashi. So Rashi says, Beduchte de kvi means B'nei Aseres HaShvatim. We're talking about the descendants of the 10 Shvatim, and v'chol kavua kemechza al mechza dami. If it's in their permanent location, so then you can't follow the Raiv, it's mechza al mechza. It's still a doubt who you're marrying. This might be someone from the Aseres HaShvatim. V'heicha kvi, where do I find that they, where are they kavua, where is their permanent residence? K'dichsiv, vayanchem b'chalachu b'chibur. The Pasuk says that they were placed in those permanent cities, and therefore, in that location, there's an issue. That's Rashi's pshat. Taisus has a different shot on the Gemara there. Taisus argues with Rashi. The beduchtayu havuruba me'aseres hashvatim. The issue is not the fact that in that location where they were placed, it's kavua, but the issue is that in that place, they're actually the majority of people there. The issue here is not that in that location, they are permanent, and therefore, even if they're in the minority, but it's kavua. The yazl iu legaba, because if the man, being maybe from Aseres HaShvatim, went out of his house and went to the wife and married her out of his house, called the parish, meruba parish. That's considered that he was parish, he left his permanent location, and therefore we do follow Raiv. Kedamrina b'sayf perekama de ksubis, as the Gemara that the Rebbe quoted before from ksubis, that as long as you left your house, that gets the status of parish, and you follow Raiv. So here we see a machlekes of Rashi and Taisvis, whether the concept of kavua goes according to the house that you're in, or is it the entire area or the whole country that you're in, and until you don't leave that entire country, you still are considered to be in your permanent residence, in your permanent location, you say kavua. So the Rebbe explains this. First, the Rebbe explains why Rashi interprets the Gemara the way he does. He says, move on for was Rashi will not learn in Taisvis. We can understand from the words of the Gemara why Rashi does not want to learn the way Taisvis does, that the issue there is that in this place it's mostly Aseres HaShvatim. Hagam as Rashi Alein is mefarish and mesechtek subis kanal as okara boil mi beisai hatadim from kol de parish. Rashi himself in Ksubis says, just like Taisvis, that if the boil leaves the house, that's considered to be parish, that he's separated from his permanent residence. And here Rashi is saying differently. Here Rashi is saying as long as you're in Chalach and Chabur, in that area of Aseres HaShvatim, it's still considered to be kavua. So what forces Rashi to change here? According to Taisvis, why does the Gemara say that the issue is in their place where they are established, where it's their permanent residence? Why does it use this term of kvi if that's not the issue? According to Taisvis, the issue is that this is a place where it's the majority Aseres HaShvatim. Von Lashon beduchte de kvi is muchach as da redt sich wegen dem von kavua. This expression of the Gemara kvi is very clear that the issue over here is the halacha of kavua, that even if they are the minority, but nevertheless this is their established place. So now the question though is, why is this situation different than the Gemara in Ksubis, the clear Gemara, and Rashi there and Taisvis say that the kavua is defined by your house, by your residence where you're living. So why here is it defined by the whole area, the place that you're living in? Das bar in them. So the explanation why this is different is as follows. Vibalt der Pasuk sagt, Vayanchim b'chalach v'gayim. Since here the Pasuk is establishing their location of residence, that they were placed in this place of Chalach. Zenen ot die Erte geworden, der Mokim Kavua von die Aseres HaShvatim. So the Pasuk is establishing and telling us that this location became the established place of collectively all of the Aseres HaShvatim. Und der Fahre sehe Kvies nicht begrenzt zu sehe Batim. So therefore this case is different. Their established place does not go according just to the house where the individual person is living, nor das ist Keil ganz Chalach v'goyme. It's the entire area of Chalach. This is the permanent place that the Torah and the Pasuk establishes that where the Aseres HaShvatim are. As Kolzman, sie gefinden sich dort, haben sie Adin von Kavua, as long as they are in that location, they are in their permanent residence, that the Torah says. Afile, wenn sie seinen Peirish mi beisam. Even if they leave, even if one individual leaves his house, he's still in the permanent location of the Aseres HaShvatim. That's why this place is different. When you talk about just a random person, a boil, that happens to live in a certain house somewhere, and he leaves his house, so his house is his permanent place of residence. The moment he leaves his house, he's Peirish. He's not anymore, he doesn't have that chshivas, that significance of being kavua in his house. But here we're not talking about a random person or a random group of people that happen to be somewhere. We're talking about Aseres HaShvatim, thousands and thousands of people that the Torah says this became their place, their permanent place, that they were placed outside of Eretz Yisrael. So therefore the entire country of Chalach and Chabur and so on is the place, the kavua place of Aseres HaShvatim. The myth is Muvam, was Rashi is Messiah. This one explains the language of Rashi when Rashi concludes and says, V'heicha kvi, and where is their kvi, where is their established permanent place? K'dichsiv v'yanchim b'chalach u'b'chabur. They were placed in these cities. The L'chayra, seemingly, was is da Rashi meisif of them, was steht befeirish and Gemara gleich nach them. What's Rashi adding to the words of the Gemara, where the Gemara brings the pasuk, v'yanchim b'chalach u'b'chabur? Nor the mitzvah masber, Rashi is trying to explain this to you. Favos zay kailu loy chapershim mi beisam. Why is it by them, by the Aseres HaShvatim, including those that left their permanent residence, their house? Ubefrat as azay is dirigilas, and especially to leave your house and to go and get married. That's more common, to get married leaving your house. The Kamayim Razal, Oisim Beis Chasnus Lebeneim. You don't get married in your private house. You make a special place for the chasana, for your children to get married. So if he got married, he probably left his house. So why, if he left his house, is he still considered to be kavua? There's a concern that this person that you think is a guy is one of these Aseres HaShvatim. Haben dort a din from kavua, so why there do they have a din from kavua? V'heicha kvi, kidichse v'yanchim. So Rashi is explaining, where is the kvius? In other words, don't think that the halacha of kavua here is the same as it usually is, which is in the house where you permanently live. But rather over here, because kidichsiv, because the pasuk is saying that Aseres HaShvatim were placed there, so therefore the location of kavua is different here. It goes on the entire area, like it says in the pasuk. That's what Rashi explains in the Gemara there, b'negeya to the Aseres HaShvatim. So now bringing it back over here, b'negeya to the Mitzrayim. There's a Mitzri that's in a status of kavua, that he's in his permanent location, and then even though there's only a miyach, you shouldn't be allowed to marry a Mitzri until the third generation. And then there's a situation of a Mitzri which is Peirish. And then you can follow the Raiv, that the Raiv in Mitzrayim are not Mitzrayim, and you can marry them right away. So what would be considered to be kavua regarding Mitzrayim? So based on what we said before, benidden di don, here in our case, vibal the Isser besteht don dem was is a Mitzri. Here, what is the Isser? The Isser is that you're not allowed to marry a Mitzri. A Mitzri, in other words, a guy that's a Mitzri. How does he become a Mitzri? Because he's a guy from Eretz Mitzrayim. Or he's a descendant from the original Goyim of Eretz Mitzrayim. Da Fais kommen, as sein Kvius is in dem ganzen Land Mitzrayim. What gave him that identity as a Mitzri? He's not just a random person that lives in a house and therefore his Kvius is just his house. Over here we're talking about people that have an identity as a Mitzri, and that's the basis, that's the whole Isser. So therefore, the Kvius of a Mitzri is where? Not his house. The Kvius of the Mitzri is the entire land Mitzrayim that gives him that identity. Kolzman, that is nit a reis from Gvul Mitzrayim, so as long as he does not leave the boundaries of Mitzrayim, afilu when it is Peirush mi Beisa, even if he did leave his house, hatte dem din von Kavua ke Mechza al Mechza. The halacha of Mechza al Mechza that we cannot follow, the majority should still apply that he's Kavua. Okay, so therefore, we have now the concept of Kavua applied in this case in a much broader sense than it usually is. Kavua is only in the house. Here the Kavua is regarding the whole land Mitzrayim. The Rebbe adds here now another point. Everything we said here is only according to Rashi's Pshat, but Taisus seems to disagree. Taisus clearly says there regarding the Aseres HaShvatim that we still follow the status of Kavua only regarding the house that the person lives in. But the Rebbe is machadish that over here regarding the Mitzrayim, Taisus may even agree to Rashi. V'yesh loymar, as das was Taisus nehmt nit an de Svara. The reason why Taisus does not accept Rashi's Svara regarding Aseres HaShvatim is his dafke benegei dem fall from Aseres HaShvatim. That's only there regarding the permanence of the Aseres HaShvatim. Und das der Fall, weil sie gefinden sich in jener Erter, hat nicht kein Scheiches zum Etzem Inyan HaKedushin, because the location that the Aseres HaShvatim live in is not directly related to the very question we have regarding this Kedushin. Is the person you're marrying a guy, or is the person marrying a Yid? That's what the question is about. Who's this person you're marrying? Regarding the very location itself, the location is not related to the very Kedushin over here, to the very question you have about whether this is a Kedushin or not. So over here, regarding any of the people that may have come from the Aseres HaShvatim, Tosfos says we go back to the original rule we always had, that Kavua follows the permanent residence, the house of a person. Schenken in unser Fall, by contrast here over here, when we're talking about the Mitzrayim, was der Isser Love bekal kommt, weil is a Mitzri. Over here, the entire Isser of marrying this Mitzri is his identity as a Mitzri, Fun Eretz Mitzrayim. And what identifies him as a Mitzri? How do you get that identity as a Mitzri? Because you're a descendant from people that original Goyim of Eretz Mitzrayim. You belong to this place of Eretz Mitzrayim. That's what gives you this whole identity that creates the very Isser we're dealing with. So in this case, even Taisus would agree, as Kozmane gefindt sich in the Gewullim von Eretz Mitzrayim, as long as this person, that's only a minority, but he's still in the original borders that gave him the very identity that makes him unique of being a Mitzri, hat adim von Kavua. So over here, he has a halacha of being Kavua, legabi de Misr von Mitzri. Regarding this Isser of a Mitzri, so the Kavua is defined by the very Isser itself here. Since the very Isser is the fact that he is a Mitzri, and what gives him that identity as a Mitzri? The land Mitzrayim. So therefore, the land Mitzrayim is the Mokem HaKviyas for a Mitzri. So therefore, over here, even Taisus will agree that the Kviyas follows the identity of the Isser. So now, Vapi Kolanal is Hodra Kushile Duchte. So this brings us back to our question on the Hezbollah that the Levush says that today you can marry a Mitzri because it's called a Parish Mirube Parish. But the question is, wie bald does any geblieben Mitzrayim in Eretz Mitzrayim? Since there are some original Mitzrayim that are there in Mitzrayim. Not the heter love be called is called the Parish. The only heter, as the Levush says, is because we rely on Roiv, that the person you're marrying was separated from his place that is Kavua, hat doch der Rambam, und Shulchan Aruch gedarf mechalik sein, zwischen Ager, was is a Reis von Eretz Mitzrayim, was hat din from called the Parish, so that the Rambam should make this distinction between a Ger that left the original location, he left the entire land Mitzrayim, and a Ger in Eretz Mitzrayim, or a Ger from the Mitzrayim that left Eretz Mitzrayim. Was hat din from Kavua, again, on a Ger in Eretz Mitzrayim, a Ger that's still in Eretz Mitzrayim, was hat din from Kavua, on his Oster bis dar Shlishi. And then it should be Oster until the third generation, the same original Issa should still apply. So why did the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch not make this distinction? This is very important. We're not just speaking about a house, whether he left his house or not. We're speaking about the entire land Mitzrayim. So it makes a difference if you're marrying a Mitzri in Mitzrayim or out of Mitzrayim. So to answer this, the Rebbe says there's really an even greater question here on this Hezbollah that the Levush says. Behaktim aggresseret me in the minyan wie es fragt der Aruch HaShulchan. An even bigger question here that the Aruch HaShulchan asks. The Gemara sagt in Nazir. The Gemara in Nazir says, as a isha loy naida, a woman has a status as a person that does not move from her permanent residence. Why? The pasuk describes a woman to being someone that the place of a woman is inside. That's the honor of a woman, to be inside a house, in bayis, and therefore a woman is a place that's kavua in her house. Und der Rebbe hat sie adin von kavua. Is the Gemara mamshich, but the Gemara continues and asks, what's if it's in a situation? If it happens here, that the woman left her house, and someone was Mekadesh or whatever happened took place outside in the marketplace. Maybe she did leave her house and someone was Mekadesh in the marketplace. How could you refer to a woman and always say that she's kavua, that she's in a permanent residence? But if she leaves her house and someone's Mekadesh there, so then she's not kavua anymore. And the Gemara answers, no. Hasam hodra lenichase. There's a concept of hodra lenichase, which is that she returns back to her permanent residence. Since a woman, primarily her place where she is most of the time is in her house, even when she leaves temporarily, she's leaving with the intention to return to her primary place where she spends her time. And therefore, even when she's outside, she's still considered to be kavua. Das heißt, as a filivens is parish mi base. So even when she leaves her home, b'shuka ashkach, he encounters her in the street, v'balta but a sof kerti zechum tzirik l'makim kviyusa, she does eventually return back to her place. Hodra lenichas, she goes back to her permanent residence. Hotzi adin from kavua. So a woman always has this din of kavua, oich v'm b'shuka ashkach, even when she's found in the marketplace. By contrast, a man, though, he spends a lot of his time outside and could even travel far locations and a business trip here, there. A man is much more on the outside, so therefore this concept of hodra lenichase does not apply by a man, only by a woman. So now we can apply this back to a Mitzri. If so, you may ask, how can we even say this concept regarding a Mitzri, that because he left Mitzrayim to get married, so therefore he left his permanent location, so now we follow Raiv. Even if the Mitzri separates from his place to go and get married to Israelis. If this Mitzri, which still has the identity of a Mitzri, so his place of living permanently is Mitzrayim. So if he goes back to his place of where he lives in Mitzrayim, so what does that mean? That even when he left, he never really left. He left to get married and he goes right back to Hodra Lenichasa. This is his real place of permanence. So even when he left, the halacha of kavua should still apply, similar to what we say by a woman. So how can we be matter to marry a Mitzri before 3 generations b'zman hazeh? The bir b'zeh. So the Rebbe now says the answer to answer this question and the previous question, to explain the words of the Levush. Why b'zman hazeh you could marry a Mitzri relying on Raiv? Is move on from Diak Lashon Rambam. It's understood from one word that the Rambam adds, and the Rambam's Lashon is Shekal ha'payrish mehen lehizgayer. Anyone that leaves from the place of the Mitzrayim in order to convert, so the Rambam is adding this word lehizgayer, cheskasa shepirish min ha'raiv. We assume that he's separated, he's from the Raiv, and therefore you could get married to this person. Why is the Rambam adding a Mitzri that left his place with the intention to become a ger? Why is that word necessary? Nachmer, the question here is even more so. Even a Mitzri that leaves his location, it wasn't with the intention to become a ger. He left Mitzrayim for whatever reason, on a business trip or whatever reason. And then he became a ger. The same halacha should apply. So why is the Rambam saying he left this place lihizgayer? No, the myth is the Rambam masber. Here the Rambam is letting you know, as the taich from parish da is nit kipshutai parish b'makayim. The idea of parish here, one that leaves his permanent place, and therefore you could follow Raiv, is not like the usual translation of parish, when you actually are leaving a physical location, a permanent place that you're in. Nor the mid guf of us that is megayer haste the parish. There's a different concept of parish that you can see over here, that is not only physical, but the very fact that is megayer, that is the parish. That is him leaving his location. The gather from parish can sein in zwei fanim. The idea of leaving your place, your permanent place, can be in one of 2 ways. Aleph, in makim gashmi, your physical location where you're living. is peirish von ein Mokim und kommt zu a zweiten Mokim. You leave one location and you come to a new location. And it has to be such a kind of leaving that you're not returning. In other words, you're not someone that is expected to return shortly to our original place, like by a woman. That's one concept. Mokim Gashmi. Beis in Matzev, the condition of the person. In sein Mokim bedinat Teire, you're leaving a certain location or a certain status that you have according to the halacha of Teire. Sein Metzius in Teire, your whole existence of who you are according to Teire. Is peirish von ein Matzev und geht rüber in a zweiten. You're leaving one condition, one status, and you're entering into a completely different status and a whole different location, spiritually speaking. Azevi benitten die done, and that's the case we're talking about over here. Was sich peirish von friedliche Matzev din als eine Yehudi Mitzri, when a Mitzri is Megayer. So he's leaving his previous halacha, his previous status of being a Goy, a Mitzri, und stellt sich rüber and is transformed durch Geiris, through conversion, in a andere Matzev, in a completely new situation of being a new person, of being Megayer. That's a different concept of Parish, which is also, Parish also has a halacha of Parish. So this is the Rebbe's Chiddush here. You have the concept of Parish that the Gemara always speaks about, which is Parish from a permanent residence, whether it's a house, whether it's a country. But over here, there's a different concept of Parish. Geirus itself consists of Parish from a certain matzav. The Rebbe is done at Shaya Chodra L'Nichase. And regarding this, there is no Chodra L'Nichase going back to the original permanence. Wie bald as ein Parish besteht in dem, was sich misgeier. Over here, the Parish, you're separating through converting. Is bei ihm nach dem the Shaykh kin Hodra. There is no going back on this gear. So therefore, this is a permanent Parish that you left this place, and therefore, over here you could apply called the Parish, the Ruba Parish. Und der Fahr paskent der Rambam Shulchan Aruch, as bezman hazeh is a ger Mitzri mutter bebas Yisrael in Allah Ifanim. Therefore, the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch are telling you that there is no distinctions about this. Bezman hazeh, you're allowed to marry a Mitzri without any distinctions. Oich wenn gefindt sich in Mitzrayim, even if he's actually in Mitzrayim. Und afile wenn lo pirish mi beisai, even if he didn't leave his actual house, of his place of residence. So he's still there in his Mokim HaKviyas. But nevertheless, it's not only that there's a different gather of Parish, which is the Ruchni, is the Geiros, but that's even more powerful than the physical location where it's still Kavua, but nevertheless we follow the status of Parish, and that alone is a reason to say that we follow Rav. Varam durch dem Gufa was sich Megayer is a Parish. This itself gives you the status of being a Parish when you're Megayer, and therefore you follow Rav. Mashein ken the andere Mitzrayim Nachrim. Was eine geblieben in Mitzrayim. The other Mitzrayim that remained in Mitzrayim and are not Megayer, Choshes and employees are Miut, even though they're only a minority, haben sie Adim von Kavua. They are the people in their permanent residence, which, as the Rebbe said before, refers to the entire land Mitzrayim. Und der Rebbe bleibt zu liebsei der Isser, zu besetzen sich in Eretz Mitzrayim, shalei nilmad mimasayim. They are there, and therefore you're not allowed to go and settle in Mitzrayim in order not to learn from their behavior. So here we see the final answer to explain the difference between the Isser of not marrying a Mitzri and the Isser of not returning to Mitzrayim. When it comes to marrying a Mitzri, he's considered to be Pairish. The very Geirus itself is Pairish, and therefore you follow Rav. When it comes to settling in Mitzrayim, where there are still Mitzrayim that are living there, so over here you have to follow the Kavua of the Mitzrayim, of the few Mitzrayim that are there, and you're not allowed to settle in Mitzrayim in order not to learn from their behavior. Now, the Rebbe adds here another few svaris to explain the significance of those few Mitzrayim that are still there in Mitzrayim. Ubefrat is more specifically as das is azam etzias. Here we're talking about a situation was yeshleima that we could say as es leitze bechlal nit zu sagen as the miuts of wattel werden bereif. That it either way does not make any sense to say that the miut over here should be annulled to the Rav. Usually we follow Rav, but in this case it doesn't make sense to follow Rav. Sai mitzad dem miut and sai mitzad dem Rav. Both, if you look closer and see the nature of what this minority is, and you also look at the nature of the majority that's here in this situation, in this case, it's not logical to follow the Rav. Weil, for two reasons. First of all, Aleph, Sezamiyat and Kamus. We're talking over here about those few Mitzrayim that are here. What makes them only a minority? A minority in numbers. Tzal mentioned the number of Mitzrayim that are left in Mitzrayim. Da is the Isser nor mitzad eichos, kilkol maseim. But on the other hand, the actual Isser of marrying a Mitzri is not something just about the number of people, but it's something about the quality, about the nature of these people, kilkul maseim, about their very immoral behavior, is mitzad ribuy and goydla eichos, is es al derech v'yachdav v'chashuv v'zvert nit bottle. So since the basis of the whole Isser is something that stands out, that's very unique and special, that in the negative, about their behavior, so therefore this is something which is very significant, and just by numbers of having a raiv, not necessarily is it bottle. And this is a concept that you find beneged to the concept of bittul beraiv, that if you have something which is choshev, it's not bottle beraiv. One of the examples, as the Rebbe is mitzayin to the Gemara in Beya, is when you have a dovish b'minyan, something that's counted and has a certain chshivas. So even though usually there's a halach of bittul beraiv, but not if something is significant, has a chshivas, there's no bittul beraiv. So over here as well, because these Mitzrayim are people that their behavior stands out in a negative way, and that's the significance of why we don't want to learn from their actions. It's not just about there's other goyim, there's these goyim, and the Eibusher doesn't want you to be in a location where you have these goyim. It's about their behavior that has a certain eichos, a certain significance and chshivas in the negative sense. That's something that can't be bottled so easily. Just to point out, really these two halachas are not exactly the same. We're talking in the entire Sikha about the halacha of kol de parish merube parish, and here the Rebbe is bringing an example of the concept of bittul beraiv. Bittul beraiv is when you have a mixture, and the minority is mixed in together with the raiv. Kol de parish is when you're talking about a question of identifying where someone came from. It's not exactly a mixture like bittul beraiv. It's two different concepts really, but they're related to each other, and the Rebbe is bringing an example from this concept of bittul beraiv. Bay is another point, looking at the nature of the majority that's going to be mevatel the raiv. Da is the raiv die Menschen von anderen Umais, was gefinden sich in Mitzrayim, nicht menaget zum Miut und mevatlei. Here, the majority, all the other nations, are not of a nature that's very different or opposite or opposing to this Miut that you want to annul. Usually when you have a mixture, or you have a bittul beraiv, or called the parish merube parish, so you have two entities that are different and separate from each other, and if you follow the majority, that annuls the status of the minority. But over here, it's not exactly that way. Why? Varum? Oich di umais zenemel kulkalim. The other goyim, even if they're not Mitzrayim, their behavior is also immoral. Es is mer nit, was the Mitzrayim zene noch mer mekulkal. The issue is that the Mitzrayim's behavior stands out even more. It's their immoral behavior is to a further extent. But the other goyim there are also somewhere in that same category to some extent. Und der Rebbe is the Mitzias von dem Raiv nit bekoyach zum Mevatel sein der Miut von the Mitzrayim. So therefore the Raiv, which has a similar nature to some extent to this Miut, which is the issue, does not have the koyach to negate and to annul their existence. And again, for this, the Rebbe brings an example in the Ha'ara from a concept of bittul min b'minoi. That when it's min b'minoi, when you have two that are of the same min, of the same type, so one can't be mevatel the other, because it doesn't break, it doesn't weaken the status of the miut if the raiv is from the very same min. So over here as well, the other goyim that exist there are also from the same min. They're also mekulkalim. So therefore, bittul beraiv does not apply here as well. And therefore, the halach of kol de parish merube parish should not apply here either. So this is the conclusion of the Chelek of Nigla, that the Rebbe explains the status of the Goyim in Mitzrayim, and as we see, the point is that the Isser of returning to Mitzrayim still applies even today. There are a minority of the Mitzrayim that are there today, and even though they are a minority, but nevertheless, they're kavua, and therefore it defines the place still being Eretz Mitzrayim, and with the original Mitzrayim, Ma'aseyim Mekulkalim, and you're not allowed to return there. So now, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Rebbe will take from this a lesson from what we can learn today from the great miracles and wonders that the Eibusher performed to what we can learn from this. Al pi anal, as in Eretz Mitzrayim, zene noch als voran von den Mitzrayim von Amal. The very same Mitzrayim that were there originally are there even today. Kum tarayis atoisvis es eiris and avedis Hashem b'yameinu eila. We can take an additional inspiration in serving the Eibusher in our times. The following introduction. Everything in Torah is included in the concept of Torah being eternal. It's for all time periods and in all occasions. Von deswegen ist da a Chiluk zwischen den Inyanim, welche mekennet mekayim sein kipshutam. There's a difference, though, between those things that cannot be fulfilled literally, und die nitzchi is zeyeres, beruchni is an Inyanim, and it's only eternal in the spiritual sense. Und die Sachen, was an euch ist, voran begashmis, and then there are those mitzvahs and those parts of Torah that are eternal and can be fulfilled even physically. Warum das beweist, as in die Inyanim is die nitzchi is noch met a gressere teikif. Over here, the nitzchias of Torah is expressed with much greater intensity. The fact that it comes down and is expressed even in the Gashmisdige world for all nations of the world to see shows the extent of the nitzchias of the Torah to a much greater degree. So the same applies over here regarding Mitzrayim. It says in the Pasuk regarding Yitzias Mitzrayim. Atem risem asher asisi Mitzrayim. You saw what I have done to the Mitzrayim. Va'atom shemoy tishmu b'kaili shmartem es brisi ve'yisem li zgula mikol ha'amim amlechas kainim v'goy kadosh. And therefore you will now listen to my voice, and you'll keep my bris. You'll be the beloved nation and the mamlechas kainim, a holy nation. So all of this that it says, all these special things that it says about the Yidden, the status of who Yidden are, is connected to the fact of Atem Reisem, because Yidden see the tremendous miracles that the Eibishter performed in Mitzrayim. Von dem is move on as der Atem Reisem asher asisel in Mitzrayim. This that Yidden see the great miracles that the Eibishter performed with Mitzrayim is a hachana to the Inyanim welche stehen in the Psukim la'achrizeh. This is a preparation and brings Yidden to what it says afterwards, and it also says va'avi eschem elai. I will bring you to me, va'atam shemaya tishmu, shmartem es brisi, and then va'yisam li zgula, as the Rebbe quoted before. When Yidden zen, be'einei basar, when Yidden can see, they can physically see with their own eyes, wie der Eibishter weist farzei nissim, beim abrechnen sich, va'ha'einish, v'chulu, von die Ummes, welche seinen Meitzer und Meikli Yisrael. So in general, when the Yidden see tremendous miracles that the Eibishter performs, and punishes Goyim that are persecuting, oppressing the Yidden, das allein ist mir eure Jiden, als sie sollen verstarkeren, sehr Briss mit Neibischen durch Shemai Tishma B'Kaili. This awakens Jiden. This inspires Jiden to strengthen their connection to the Eibishter, to listen to what the Eibishter tells them. So davon ist euch verstandig. So from this we understand. Als wenn Jiden sehen, wie der Eibishter rechnet sich ab mit die Eretz Mitzrayim, that if we see that the Eibishter is punishing the Goyim that exist today in Eretz Mitzrayim, was dort seine Faran derselbe Mitzrayim wie amal. And don't say Eretz Mitzrayim today, it's a different people, it's not the same. No, as we said, there are some of the same Mitzrayim there in Eretz Mitzrayim, kavua in the land. Chazet zechiben noch einmal begashmius leinei basar, dem atem reisem asher asisi Mitzrayim, al derech vis es gewen, bepam rishayna. So by these miracles that are performed today in our generation, the Eibishter is repeating and giving us the opportunity again to physically see those miracles in order to take that inspiration to come to what it says afterwards, V'avias Chamelai, and so on. So as I mentioned, the Rebbe is referring over here to the miracles that happened at the 6-day war. Darf das b'meila reisrufen by the Yidden, v'zen asher asisil Mitzrayim. So this should awaken with Yidden that see these miracles that the Eibishter performed for the Mitzrayim, at Taisvis decided us, an added inspiration. To listen to the Eibishter and to follow the bris, as Yidden sollen sich starken in Kiyam HaTorah und Mitzvahs, to strengthen each other, to fulfill Mitzvahs, und sich führen wie ein Am Sgula, and to behave like the beloved nation, Zainam Amlechas Kainim v'Goy Kadosh, and to be that priestly nation and that holy nation. Und das wird achane kreuva zu dem Bekoiloi zu Shmo. This is the close preparation to listening to the Eibishter's voice. Was bringt dem Hayom from Bias HaMashiach, Kach Tochas Mashiach Tzidkenu, as the Gemara said, that Mashiach said that he would come today. And when he didn't come today, so Eliyahu Novi actually said that Mashiach would come today, and when he didn't come today, he explained that Hayom means today in Bekoilei Shmo, when you listen to the Torah and Mitzvahs. So this will bring that fulfillment of that promise, Bekorev Mamish, really in our days.